Welcome to the podcast of Peculiar Ventures, where we will be discussing multiple different gaming topics. And today, the gaming topic we're going to be discussing is movement in video games.
Who are we?
We would be Shane and my good friend here, Ali.
Hello.
And today we're going to be discussing that and stuff. So, when it comes to movement in video games, Ali, like what is a game that you think of immediately? Like when I say movement in a game.
Two things come to mind, one due to recency bias, the other one just in general. Mario, I think, is like the typical example of like how important movement is in games and how movement can be fun and that sort of stuff. And the other one's Celeste, because I played it this morning, and the movement in that game's so perfect.
Yeah, I definitely think Mario's one of the big ones because Mario's such a long-running franchise, and also the combination of the fact that like Mario was the first real big step into like 3D platformers and 3D environments and like how people maneuver through them. And it was kind of like this whole thing of like you go watch like speedrunners and shit like that, and you see how people use the movement system in the game and like try to use the way that you can like launch yourself in different directions to get places efficiently. I mean, movement in games, definitely speedrunning comes to mind, because speedrunning is something that's like, you know, Zelda, for instance, you're doing like the back hopping to get everywhere, and that's kind of like using the game's system to get yourself somewhere the most efficiently, the fastest, which isn't necessarily designed into the game, but is possible through it. To start off, I think we should talk about stuff that's like designed into the game, like purposefully, or seemingly purposefully at least. Stuff like, I mean, a lot of recent games, it's been really popular to have, like, parkour elements in your game. I remember, like, a big example of one that was like, oh, man, it's going to have parkour, and then it was just, like, nobody cared after a week was Brink.
Oh, I totally thought you were going to say a different example.
No.
But it makes sense, because I don't even remember Brink having parkour elements.
Yeah, Brink was that thing where everybody's like, oh, yeah, you could, like, as you run up to stuff, you climb over it, and, like, that kind of thing. Like, almost... I don't want to say auto movement, because I don't think it was on the same bar as like Assassin's Creed or Shadow of Mordor or like Batman, where it's like hold down a button to do cool flippy parkour shit in a direction, and you kind of just do it. I think Brink, you had to actually like, you know, climb over stuff, but I'm not sure. I honestly didn't play it. I just remember that it was very heavily like, oh man, the movement, and then I think it was an okay game, but the content was like super lacking, and people were like, "This is just not a $60 game."
Oh, that was sold for $60. Wow.
I think it was.
When I think parkour games, the first thing that comes to mind is Mirror's Edge, just because that's sort of the whole like gameplay about.
Yeah, Mirror's Edge is definitely a game that hinges on its movement specifically. It's not like an element of the game that like people feel like that is the game, the movement.
The game exists to be a parkour simulator.
Yeah, unlike games like, I guess a more recent one would be like Apex Legends, where in Apex and, you know, by proxy like Titanfall games, you have the shit where you run up to something, like you can slide on the ground, you can run up like up to things and like climb over them by just pressing the jump, like holding jump at them, and it's kind of nice, but it's intentional parkour, like it doesn't just happen by you pushing forward on the joystick like you, or like, you know, whatever you're using. But it's like, it's funny because it's to the point for me right now where I play like another shooting game. Like while I was playing through Metro Exodus, I was like trying to play it like it was Apex, where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna slide down this hill, and I'm like, oh, because Apex, the movement in Apex is really good. I like it a lot. It feels really fluent, and that's a game I've been playing recently that has some really like nice movement that feels good, especially for a shooter where a lot of shooters, like especially pre-sprint mechanic shooters like the original Halo series, were like, when you go to a game that has sprinting, when you go to a game that has fast movement, you go back to this other shooter and you're like, I feel like I'm moving so fucking slowly.
Yeah, I feel a lot of that is because the goal of movement sort of like changed in the genre over that period of time, where a lot of the skill in old shooters that they wanted you to have is more so the skill of positioning was the key skill they wanted to test, and movement was sort of a means to that end rather than a whole mechanic by itself. Your goal was to say, if it's a cover shooter, you want to move to where you're behind cover, but like in the terms of the overall battle strategy, a well-positioned piece of cover, rather than now with sprinting. You can still have the cover-based system and position-based, but it sort of makes the A to B a lot faster. And now I think they want shooters to be a bit more free. You aren't necessarily worrying about cover to cover, but with a heavy movement system, you kind of want the gameplay to be more about outmaneuvering your opponents in a sense, where you can. It's not just if I'm in front of you and you shoot me first and I'm going to always lose. You could potentially dodge or have some way to,
play around it or outplay, quote unquote. Definitely, it definitely it feels good to be able to, sprint and move faster in those games for sure. And movement is another element of gameplay that I really enjoy. I like the ability, if I play a game, I tend to like characters who have a good amount of mobility because I like not feeling like I'm anchored to the ground.
Yeah.
But I do play characters inside of Apex Legends, for an example, that are very heavy and anchored to the ground, but that's intentionally heavy. They are heavy because that is their design, and then the more nimble characters are nimble by design. It's not just everybody kind of moves like a rail car. So, do you have any other games that are really coming to your mind? What was the game you said that you were what comes to mind that wasn't the one you were playing recently? It was
Mario or Celeste?
Celeste.
Yeah, Celeste is actually really interesting because it's a hard. Do you know anything about Celeste?
No.
So it's a hard indie platformer, much like, say, Super Meat Boy is probably the most typical example.
Yeah.
Where, and more so than Super Meat Boy, it's kind of based on a screen-by-screen perspective. Each screen usually is just condensed to the size of one small room, but sometimes they're longer, where you see the immediate puzzle of the room and you need to find a way to navigate to the end. Or if there's a goal within it, you try to get to it. And there's only three mechanics, really. There's moving at a singular speed. There's no run button like in Mario.
Okay.
There's jumping, climbing, which climbing has a whole series of mechanics associated to it, but it's mainly a way to get around without using your main mechanic, which is the dash, where once every time you're airborne, so you need to touch the ground again or find some other way to refill your dash to be able to, you just have a burst of speed and you input any of the 8 cardinal directions and you go in that direction. And that's all that the core gameplay is based on. But there are a lot of emergent mechanics that come through that just because of how the game's sort of physics works. The game does have a momentum system where how you move following a dash is faster than if you were to just walk for the same amount of time. And speedrunners use that a lot, actually, to go really fast just by using the game's sort of collision physics. So in speedrunning, the main movement tech and it's actually taught to you by Celeste, only when you go through the last level, is called a hyper dash, where if you jump at a downward forward angle and then jump, your dash momentum actually carries you horizontally, and you have a huge burst of horizontal speed at a low angle.
Okay.
And you can even chain those together because you touch the ground during the dash, you actually do replenish your dash. Even if at some point during the hyper dash you're in the air, you will eventually regain your dash, which you can tell because Madeline, the player character, her hair changes color. Mm-hmm. It's red normally. When you dash, it turns blue until you next touch ground or touch an object that gives you back your dash, in which case it'll turn red again. But that's sort of the main mechanic, and all the speed mechanics just kind of come as a byproduct of the game's physics, which is sort of an easy way to kind of have emergent, fast gameplay design without having to rely on glitches. And the developers of Celeste came to that conclusion because they are fans of speedruns, and they've been making games that have speedrun potential for years.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like it's cool when a designer puts something in their game that seems like an exploit, but it was purposefully there. Like you were talking about, the pushing yourself with your momentum from an angle. That doesn't seem like something that most people would necessarily purposefully design into a game. It seems like an end result of the engine they created, and that's always really cool. Because I like it when again, when they think, even when they just discover things in their system and in what they've created, and they're like, oh shit, this is really cool, let's make it a core part of the game. Yeah. And they include that in there. So you were just talking about a game that has a lot of jumping, but and I was gonna say, you know, one thing that's funny is a game like Spelunky, a platformer where, like, you know, that's, you know, the whole thing of, like, if you die, you go back to the start and stuff. I find it, whenever I play that game, I never stop having the sprint button on. Because, like, I don't know, it just feels weird to move slower than that when I know I can move faster. Unless I'm trying to be super ultra careful on, like, an edge or something, I just always have the sprint button on. It just, I don't know, just going faster feels better to me. But on a different note, let's talk about movement in games that don't have the ability for you to jump. So, like, I think of Zelda immediately because, like, the Zelda series, oftentimes it was like either you can only jump if you run over an edge specifically, like you can't manually choose to jump, or like like in the old the older style, like, 2D Zelda games where, like, there's literally you just couldn't jump. That's just,
unless you had a Rock's Feather, that's the only way that let you jump.
Yeah. And so, like, I definitely I like controlled movement. Like, we're talking about, you know, a lot of going fast and, like, maintaining your momentum. Like, you know, a good example of that too is like Sonic, where Sonic is all about you're going fast, but you kind of know what you're doing, and, like, the levels are set up in a way where you don't feel like you're just kind of flying towards things. Like, you feel like you know what's coming up and stuff like that. But games like that really restrain your movement so that you have to experience what's happening in the game. So, like, you know, I've been playing Gears 5, and there's parts of Gears, you know, when they get into heavy dialogue parts, there's a part where you go into a surviving camp, and you pretty much have to, like, walk or, like, kind of, like, jog through it. So it's a pretty long walk, and it's just dialogue of people talking and, like, the people in the area, and I like it a lot because it's like a downtime area where it really lets you listen in and experience these characters who are, like, kind of interacting with you, but also interacting with each other. Like, because you know, you're part of the COG, everybody hates you, and that's the thing is, so they're always just like, you know, hey COG, get out, and stuff like that, and they'll yell at you, but then you're hearing just people talk and stuff like that. Like, there's two people talking about, like, oh, do you know how to drive one of these things? It's like two mechanics, and they're talking about, like, driving this mech suit. It's definitely, I like it when movement is used in a way of, like, restricting you to make you deal with something. Like, I guess another example is, like, if you're injured. If your character's injured and, like, it hinders your movement in a way. Like, can you think of a game that hinders your movement based on, like, injury? I know Sea of Thieves, even though it's not for very long, if you, like, fall off a cliff, you, like, break your leg and your character, like, limps for a little while until he heals back up, essentially, or they heal back up. I'm trying to think of other games that, like, hinder your movement.
The main example I think of when you tell me, like, based on injury is kind of like any, say, like, wave-based shooter where you're playing with multiple people, and when you lose your health, what would normally be like a failure state in these games, even, like, you could say Fortnite has it in the co-op modes where you, after your health is reduced, you're in a down state.
Okay.
Or like Borderlands, like fight or flight state.
Yeah.
Where all your movement options are really limited, or in some cases just completely gone, and you just have a little chance to try to fight back a little, maybe get in some damage on some enemies or something. And there it seems like it's sort of a punishment in the sense that, you know, you didn't play well enough, so we're going to remove that option for you and show you that you shouldn't have done this. But we're not going to be so harsh to punish you as that you just die or the mission ends there. If you have a partner that has to go out of their way to save you now, and they're able to do so and stay alive, then yeah, you can be brought back, usually with very low health as a result. That was the first thing that kind of came to mind when you said...
hindered movement?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's also stuff like... when it comes to movement, like, you know, if you're moving through snow, for example, you know, you'll move slower because it's, like, deeper, like you're moving through water, and your character will be hindered by that movement.
That's a classic example, like a water level, like compare Mario movement when you're in an overworld level to when you're in an underwater level.
Yeah.
And Sonic, and especially old platformers like that.
Yeah, which notoriously a lot of people absolutely hate water levels for a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is because of how movement is handled in them, where you play the whole game without this sort of handicap, but then you're sort of put into it, and it doesn't really feel congruent to, like, the rest of what the gameplay tests.
Yeah, I mean, so for sure, I like water levels, because I like it when they shake up like how the game is played.
Yeah.
But I do understand the hatred for water levels from a lot of people, because a lot of people like that is like every time there's a water level on anything, they just absolutely don't like it. I like, so like for an example, I do love what's the name of the level inside of Super Mario 64 with the eel in it?
Oh, Jolly Roger Bay.
Jolly Roger Bay, yeah. Well, not only because the music in that level's awesome. I love the music from that level. But I really like Jolly Roger Bay. I liked... And I feel like a lot of the 3D platformers handled, like, swimming in them in a reasonable way. Like, sometimes it feels a little hard to maneuver yourself. Especially since, like, you gotta get close to the eel, but then you don't want the eel to hit you, and then you gotta try and get the star from behind its tail. And that feels a little bit awkward, but I definitely like having swimming mechanics and stuff like that, and having them experiment with the movement, because it's just really cool to like. It feels different to be there, which shows you it's different. You're not on land, you're underwater, and it conveys the difference in location. Because like for instance, in the Gears of War series, when there's strong wind blowing against you, your characters like move slower when they're moving towards the wind, and like it's pushing you in a direction, and the movement's being used to convey the fact that you're essentially in the middle of a storm, and it can make things more difficult, but for a good reason. Like that's kind of the experience of like if the character is in a more difficult situation, so obviously it's more difficult for them. How do you feel about a part of like a lot of shooting games? I definitely in Gears of War. I'm not sure about generally FPSs don't do it as much. I'm not sure, but like suppression. So you're suppressed, so your movement is slowed because you're being shot at. You're taking bullets. I know that the Gears series always had that, where like if you're trying to like sprint at somebody and they're shooting at you directly, like it's gonna slow down your sprint because you're being suppressed. I'm trying to think of other games that do it. I can't think of an FPS that does it, but I'm sure there are FPSs that do it. But definitely that's a cool mechanic in the fact that like you feel the weight of all the damage you're taking on. Like you're taking on so much damage, it's really just like forcing you down essentially. And hammering at you.
It's definitely like a punishment sort of mechanic. To sort of deter strategies from, you can't just rush in and kind of bullet sponge everything with no consequences. There are consequences.
Yeah, because Gears is a huge game about its shotgun. And obviously, they want you to be able to like shoot somebody down with a machine gun. They don't want them to be able to just run up to you and then shotgun you before you could take them out when they're literally charging directly at you, like sprinting in your direction.
Yeah.
There are a lot of ways that like movement hindrance is used to really like convey something inside of a game. How do you feel about like slide? Like when you land on the ground but you keep going.
Slide in what's an example that you're talking about? Because
obviously ice is a big example.
Yeah.
Like when ice shows up in a game, and that's obviously to convey the fact obviously you're on ice and like it's not stable ground and you're sliding around. But there are games that have like you slide. So when you give yourself momentum. So like Sonic, for example, you give yourself momentum, you land, and then you slide forward. Like you don't stop immediately. You don't stop on a dime. And so how do you feel about like how games tend to implement that? Like are there any examples of games that you really like that have that?
The main example I think of when you tell me that, it comes to like Luigi in most Mario games. That's his differentiating factor for Mario. He jumps higher, but his gimmick is he slides when he moves at all. His shoes have worse grip, and as such, he slides. I
like the idea of just like the fact that Mario's got his like nice good grip running shoes, and Luigi just throws on his like skater shoes, and he's just like. He's just got amazing hops, but goddamn, when he lands on that ground, he's not going to grip it. He's just going to slide around.
He also usually has a higher top speed, which is how they balanced it in the first games. I think it's a kind of cool thing, especially if you're making a 2D platformer with different characters. It's one of the only ways you can really like have a different character without changing a lot of fundamental things. I think an important thing for it is to make it not super unfair in the sense of especially because like Mario, some levels are built for Mario, and they often tend to have one blocks or so jumps, where it would take up maybe a little more than Mario's sprite length. But with Luigi sliding, those jumps might be impossible unless you implement a sort of like kind of last hope jump, where if you slide off, maybe for the first couple moments after you slide up, you can still jump just like normal. And just a little mechanic like that could make it easy to make sliding not feel super bad.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, obviously, like, stop on a dime kind of movement is probably more ideal because you get more control of where you are.
For, like, precision platforming games, I think it's an important decision if you're trying to make a precision-based platformer. If you want to not be a precision-based platformer, then kind of having that sort of, like, loose traction sliding can make it feels a lot more fluid for sure. Like you were saying, Sonic, the main difference that Sonic has from Mario in terms of normal, like, speed feel is that Sonic games feel more fluid than Mario's feeling more rigid.
It's about the speed feel.
It is about the speed feel. All about the speed feel.
I'm still stuck with the image. Like, I'm thinking of like Mario Hoops 3 on 3 because now I'm just thinking of the
I'm glad you played this game.
Yeah,
too, I played the hell out of that
I'm
game.
thinking of the Mario Brothers just in like basketball shorts and Jordans, just like jumping around.
What was that NBA Street game that had NBA Street Volume 2? That was the one that had Mario characters on the GameCube, I think.
Did it?
Yeah, it had Mario, Luigi, Peach. It may have only been those three. They may have also had Wario. It was only the GameCube version of Mario. I think it was Streets Volume 2 that had it.
That's really funny. I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah.
That's really good. Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to talk about, like, so I don't really play a lot of racing games. Probably the racing game I played the most is Mario Kart.
Yeah, same.
And, like, if we're talking about movement in, like, racing games, that's a good part of those games. The way that you move, like drifting and all that kind of stuff, and controlling the movement, controlling your momentum. I've always loved the Mario Kart franchise, but I've never really been, like, a Forza person or, like...
Yeah.
I think I played through, like, the Need for Speed games, like, once or twice.
Yeah, same here.
When I was younger. And then Halo's always been a game that has, like, it's always been praised for its vehicle control. Like, how its vehicles work. And, like, generally you have something like a tank, which you're not going to slide around a lot on. But then, you get to the Warthog, and the Warthog is going to have more slide, like when you stop and stuff like that, to kind of convey that, you're on a faster vehicle, like a car isn't going to just stop the moment you hit the brakes.
Yeah.
And I understand the movement in that. I'm trying to... Can you think of a game that has, like, awful vehicle controls that you just hated?
I feel like some vehicles in Halo I remember not liking because they didn't... Obviously, every vehicle moves different, and some of them I was really attuned to. Like, my favorite vehicle in Halo was the Ghost, and the Ghost always felt super
That was like the stop on the dime.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So that Warthog must have felt kind of weird for you.
Yeah, I was never much a fan of being the Warthog.
And then, like, when you get to Halo 3, you're like, get on the Mongoose, and you're like, how do I control this fucking thing?
I did not like a Mongoose either.
I loved the Mongoose, but...
I could see the appeal to it. I was just so used to the Ghost, and I really liked how the Covenant vehicles... They all had, like, the kind of... Most of them, they seemed to be, like, jet-propelled, or at least the Ghost was. And they kind of really felt
Hover
like
vehicles.
it, too, yeah.
It's funny because when I'm thinking of a vehicle I hated, we can just talk about Mass Effect 1. We can just talk about the vehicle in Mass Effect 1. It was so annoying. They shoehorned vehicle segments into there because they're like, yeah, you want to explore. It's cool to explore. And then it ends up being really tedious and annoying. The thing is, like, the planets were either, like, super empty and you were, like, moving around them, crashing into stuff and, like, getting stuck in, like, craters, or it was just, like, the vehicle controlled like crap and you were forced to, like, fight lengthy battles in the vehicle and you're like, I just want to be on foot.
I think an example of one, it's not necessarily a bad vehicle, but one that I don't think it was kind of shoehorned in and the game wasn't really built around it. I never really like riding a horse in most Zelda games because they really don't like imperfect level geometry. They don't like to be on anything but a completely flat plane.
Oh,
and if there's a little, like, hill or something, the horse behavior sort of goes out the window. And in the worst case, the horse will just go up on its hind legs and completely stop, and you'll have to slowly move and maneuver around it. I feel like the only game that did it well was probably Breath of the Wild, because the horse really had a feel for the terrain, but not in the way that they wouldn't handle like a little hill or something.
Yeah, I was playing through Shadow of the Colossus again, and that was one of those games where, like, the horse feels pretty good to ride, but there's definitely points where, like, you get near a rock, and it's like, whoa, I don't want to go on that, and you're like, I'm not even that close to it, and the horse just freaks out, and so that's, like, a way that I understand, like, because they wanted to design the game where, like, you can't jump off a cliff on your horse. That was the point. They wanted to make it so the horse is like, hell no, I'm not jumping off that cliff. I ain't no lemming. And you're just like, but sometimes you're crossing a bridge and the horse is just freaking out the whole way. And sometimes when you cross a bridge, like, I noticed you can literally just let the horse do its own thing. Like, you stop guiding it, you just push forward, and it kind of, like, steers it for you because the horse avoids edges. When it comes to, like, combat on the horse, like when a couple of the colossi you have to fight on horseback, that's fine. Yeah. And I thought it was handled really well, and I like how that horse moves. It was just kind of the overworld and moving through it that, like, sometimes the horse was kind of annoying. And then also the horse felt kind of weird where, like, sometimes it would keep going if you didn't keep, like, hi-eyeing it, and then sometimes the moment you stopped hitting it with the spur kicks, it just stopped. It just stopped moving, and you're like, why don't you momentum? Come on.
It's weird in those ways where the vehicle that you drive also has a sort of AI governing it, like the horse in those cases.
Yeah. It's definitely weirdly inconsistent almost when it comes to just a few things, but it felt really good in the game in general. And, like, Shadow is one of those games where you don't really have a lot of movement options, but you still, like, I mean, that's kind of, you're small and these things are gigantic, and the whole idea is that, like, you're, like, slowly climbing these things to get to where you want to go, and you're trying to figure out your stamina system to make sure that you don't just fall off. And that game really does not punish you as hard as you'd think it would with fall damage. Like, you can fall well over, like, 8 stories and just be like, oh, that kind of hurt, and get back up. So,
yeah, it's actually really interesting that you bring up that game in particular, because I have read a bit about Team Ico, the team that made that game, and Ico and The Last Guardian, and they have a very particular design philosophy when it comes to, like, how they make their games feel, which they don't want, like, a lot of games like Mario, to move your character is very easy, but to them, they actually want you to kind of have some difficulty doing things that in reality are kind of hard tasks. To kind of just scale just a sheer cliff shouldn't be possible, and that's kind of what their gameplay is designed to emulate, sort of. It's why being on a Colossus, which is not just a sheer cliff, but a completely moving creature of its own free will, they don't want it to be easy to climb up it. But like you said, the fall damage is meant to be... The point of it is to climb up it, but the point is also that the Colossus should knock you off most of the time if you don't know exactly what you're doing. So they don't want to discriminate, like, you being super cautious about climbing it, because that's kind of the point. They want
they don't want it to be like a situation of, like, if you mess up, you're dead.
Yeah.
They didn't want that, like, make a mistake, dead.
They didn't want that level of realism to, if you were actually encountering a Colossus, you would. But it's really interesting that they have that design philosophy, which I think more so has its roots in, like, kind of arcadey game design, where obviously arcades, they wanted to get your money. So the easiest challenge you can kind of present a player with was, don't move exactly how you think a player should move, because then you'll probably get some quarters out of them just learning how to move in this game. And I don't think necessarily that Shadow of the Colossus in those games are arcadey, but I think that's where kind of that design philosophy sort of stems from.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of, like, kind of an auto move style of thing, like, how do you feel about the Arkham Knights, the Assassin's Creed, like, the movement where, like, a lot of it is handled for the player, it's just very cinematic? Like, what's your opinion on that?
That's fine if that's what the game is going for. It can sometimes help to have those things sort of taken away from the player, just because it sort of lends to the cinematic experience. And I think you see that a lot in, like, Uncharted type of games too, where the cinematicness of it is a more important quality than how the game feels to play. And that's a fine design choice. It's just sort of a design choice that you need to make up front with the game and then kind of stick to.
I enjoyed the Shadow of Mordor and, like, Shadow of War style games, because I enjoyed, like, it's just a straight, it's a power fantasy game. You're just literally like you're like, oh, I'm this cool badass dude, and watch me like. And I also loved the orc politics part of it, like manipulating and controlling the orcs, and like, oh, this is my orc. He's my collect my orcs. Gotta collect all my ugly orc boys.
Yes.
And that's a lot of fun, and like I do like it's cool to have the mechanics of leap on person to assassinate and stab. And we could talk about the combat in that game another time, because the combat in that game it's not that good, but it's fun. At least for a little while. But yeah, the movement in that game it's very much built around the idea of just like push stick in the direction and you're gonna do cool shit. It's gonna look cool. You're gonna like it.
It's like you said, it's a very good thing to sort of promote player empowerment, which some games try to promote. And I honestly think that's kind of like the core design philosophy of Mario to an extent, and a lot of games, like you said, where the point of it is to be fun, so the player feels like they're an active agent in the world, and they can do what they want to. They want there to be synergistic with what the character thinks is going to happen, or what the player thinks is going to happen, is what happens in the game. And some games don't do that, specifically to sort of have that disconnect that you can't exactly do it like how you think you would.
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, a good example I think is like you have games where, like, if you look at, let's say, an Elder Scrolls game from the third person, like you're imagining your character doing way cooler shit than the shit they actually do on the screen. Like you're watching them and they're just kind of like swinging a sword back and forth to kill people, and it's like it's nowhere near as cool looking as like you'd think it would be of like this great warrior fighting people off. Like you can imagine them like parrying blows and like getting stabs in and stuff. I feel like a game that really does that, this is a little bit off topic, but a game that it's kind of movement is Doom. The new Doom. Yeah. When you kill things in the new Doom, like when you go execute stuff, that's the way you imagine like Doom Guy to just start like smashing heads and blowing stuff up, and like it looks really cool. You feel really cool when you do it, and the way the character moves around doesn't feel like you're just, essentially a gun on a railway that's just moving around. So that game did a really good job at like just making you feel that badass element in the way that the character moves.
It sort of lends to a very unique sort of type of game where it's kind of it's very momentum focused. Like you want to be constantly pushing the character forward from sort of enemy to enemy, and that's sort of how the level design of Doom is set up, where each enemy is sort of placed in a particular point where if you wanted to play it as fast as possible and you knew the movement options that would let you go through as fast as possible, you can. And it's really like spellbinding to watch like a Doom speedrun, because a really well done Doom speedrun is a dance where you just see, like, imagine a ballroom with just the Doom Marine, just the entire slews of demons, and he's dancing with all of them until they're bloody pulp. That's how I would describe Doom.
Well, now I'm just thinking of the Mortal Kombat fatality with Kano, where he like stabs a bottle into their neck and then he's dancing with them. Yeah, that's the ballroom dance one. Well, on the note of speedrunning, let's talk about like exploitative movement. So like, an example that I can talk about, I've played the series for a long time. Gears of War is a game like where at a casual level it's like, all right, you hop into cover, you move over the cover, and you roadie run places. But when you get to like super competitive gameplay, when you see like really experienced Gears of War players, they're launching themselves off of walls. Like they're wall bouncing constantly. And that's like they're using the movement, the cover system, to force out a movement that allows them to like become incredibly hard to predict where they're going to move, and incredibly difficult to hit with headshots and hit with gunshots. And in shooters, movement is a big deal, obviously, because it's harder to hit people when they move sporadically. Like bunny hopping. Bunny hopping inside of like shooters has been a thing for a long time, because you don't want to just have your head be in a stationary position that somebody can just put their crosshair on and follow. You want it to be hard to track yourself.
Yeah.
I wouldn't really consider that like exploitative. I don't know. I guess bunny hopping is kind of on par with what like bouncing between cover is in like Gears of War.
The bouncing between covers sounds like to me not exploit in the sense that like they're more, I guess it's exploit in the sense that they're sort of using some facets of the game engine to get more speed or more just some kind of benefit out of, which I include a lot of examples of this sort of game design that often comes from mistakes or oversights in a game's implementation that allow for a speedrunner to really get through a game a lot faster than intended. The main example I think of is from my favorite game series, Metroid Prime. It's very different watching how a casual person plays that game to how a speedrunner plays that game. Because a casual person, is gonna move forward and jump and explore the space, how the designer intends. But a speedrunner knows that the game has a speed cap when you're moving forward, and that sort of determines your pace. But it doesn't have a speed cap when you're moving horizontally. So the way that they move in speedruns is they use a lot of techniques. They sort of aim the camera not forward like you would think you would, but at a 90-degree angle to where they want to move, and then they dash, and when they dash, they don't have a horizontal speed cap. So as long as they keep on chaining dashes, they will get through a room a lot faster than you would just walking through it. Even doing the normal platforming, that's the fastest way to move, using scan dashes and L jumps and those sort of movement techniques.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of how you can kind of use movement systems to achieve your goals more efficiently by moving in a way that seems unintended. I mean, a big example is let's think about wave dashing. Wave dashing is a big part inside of Melee, and even in the new Mortal Kombat game, there's actually a function where you can increase your walking, your walking speed forward, your dash speed. You can dash cancel, where you use the block to dash cancel, and different characters actually can do it differently efficiently. So that's kind of weird. One character's really good at it. It's interesting to see how people who really invest all of this time into these games really master how to manipulate how they move throughout the game and how that affects it at a competitive, or even speedrunning's competitive, so yeah, esports and speedrunning and all that competitive stuff, and how people move inside of those games to try and really take advantage of the systems. And I was just thinking of in Sea of Thieves, something as simple as you have it where in Sea of Thieves you can do a sword dash, where you dash forward with your sword a short distance, but the way that it works in the game is it registers the dash, and then it registers if the ground is under your feet, and then it slows you down and stops you. But if you dash off of a cliff, if you dash, if you get to the water's edge and you jump as you use the dash off of the water, it will launch you across the surface of the water because you're not touching the ground. And so that's a way that I use that quite often, because people, it's got PvE elements, but it's also got PvP elements if you run into other people.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you really want to get to somebody's ship really fast, you just sword dash off the deck of your ship and you just go flying towards their ship. And so it's really funny to see stuff like that. Obviously probably wasn't intended, but it's a big part of the game, and that's a part of the learning curve of learning the different things you could do in that game. And I'm trying to think of other games that really have a learning curve of movement.
I think big ones are obvious. I think it's a huge component of a lot of different speedrunning games.
Yeah.
They often call them speed games in the community for ones that are really attuned to not just fast movement, but kind of flashy to a spectator's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think Celeste looks really good from a casual person looking at the speedrun. It just looks really impressive compared to how a normal game is. But as for one that I know has a huge learning curve, but to learn one of the key facets of its speedrun, Mario 64 I think has the best one, with the most important technique for breaking that game is the backwards long jump. Are you familiar with the backwards long jump?
No, actually.
The backwards long jump is due to a variety of glitches, not really glitches, a variety of unnoticed by the game designers, really unintended behavior with how Mario accumulating speed works. Mario is pretty good at checking when you're reaching the speed cap and making sure things decrement your speed in correct ways. However, the one place that they do not are in corners. So whether it be the corner of a room or something, if you keep on long jumping, but you long jump backwards, so you kill all your vertical momentum and the point when it starts going back, if you intersect with a corner at just the right point, you kind of get stuck in the backwards long jump, and if you keep pressing A, each A press will give you more speed with no speed cap, and eventually once you cross a threshold, you will sort of just zip out.
So it just kind of rubber bands you and launches you.
Yeah, and not in a kind of, hit detection, making like replacing you in the right place. You move as the consequence of all the momentum you've built up, and it usually sends you so far fast forward that the game doesn't check for things that, like collision. You're so fast that you go through the point that the game.
Oh,
will check
so that's
collision.
how you break into different areas.
Yeah. So the main thing it's used for is any of the like think to get to the second Bowser area. You know how there's the watery film before Dire Docks that leads to Bowser in the Fire Sea?
Yeah.
Or no, it's in front. The thing that leads to Dire Docks is in front of Bowser in the Fire Sea. You go through that because it only checks on one frame, and you would on one frame you were here, on the other frame you were behind it because you're moving so fast. So it never sends you to the level, and you're just behind it and you can go to Bowser in the Fire Sea. It also lets you get through the infinite staircase. The way the infinite staircase works is when you hit the end of it, it's a loading point that then just loads the next section of the stair. This is the previous section again.
So you break through the loading point,
and you just go straight to Bowser in the sky.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really funny. Because I've seen like definitely Battle for Bikini Bottom speedruns where you watch SpongeBob like they're doing something like where they're repeatedly doing an action and then suddenly they just turn and SpongeBob just launches himself in a direction. And I know like they're remaking that game, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I
it was
assume
announced like the week before E3, if I remember.
I assume
right.
they're trying to remake it in the same like game engine, same system where like everything still that you could exploit before probably will still be exploitable. It's just an HD update of it, but I don't know.
It depends. I don't know who's handling the development of the game, if it's the same team or if it's a new one. If it's a new one who's heavily invested in the speedruns, they'll probably try to keep in at least the core mechanics, but they, depending on like if they have access to the same exact engine and source code, they might not be able to recreate it perfectly, because a lot of these speedrun exploits are just sort of not checking for edge cases in the engine programming. So it's hard if you move it to a new engine to sort of keep these features still there.
So, what about jumping? Like when it comes to jumping in games, there's like some games where you can like small hop, tiny hop, like Call of Duty, I guess would be a good example of just like a regular small hop kind of game. And then you have like Halo where you can jump a little bit higher because you're in space and stuff like that. And then you have like a lot of platformers that got like real big jumps, obviously Mario. And then you have games where you just can't. I'm trying to think of how jumping involved in gameplay, other than we talked about like the bunny hopping earlier, has really been heavily involved inside of gameplay in non-platformer games. Because in platformer games, it's core part of the gameplay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of like jump mechanics. Like, it's still hilarious to me that in Smite you can jump, but it doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't even move your hitbox. You just
does it even move you faster at all? Like if you jump,
it affects gameplay in no way. I think maybe it locks you into the animation. You can't like do anything while you're doing it other than move. But it literally serves no gameplay purpose. It's just part of. I think it's just part of the engine they're using.
That makes sense.
It was just in there, but that's always funny to me. But I'm trying to think of games that like have jumping as like became a core like part of the gameplay without it necessarily being designed to be one. I mean, in a lot of fighting games, obviously jump-ins really matter, but that's again like a very intended thing.
Yeah, I would say those are intended. I'm trying to think of examples of maybe some weird like RPGs or something. I'm not sure if it counts, but I know jumping is an important part of source engine game speedruns. So like Half-Life and I think it's true in Portal as well. But the speed mechanics are all about bunny hopping in that game, where sort of in a similar thing to the Mario backwards long jump. I'm not super familiar with it, so this explanation might be wrong, but I believe how bunny hopping works in Source Engine is if you keep on pressing spacebar, it actually does give you the initial boost, like, when you kick off the ground, you should be getting a boost of speed. I believe that happens even when you're airborne, just the first bit of it, and I know that bunny hopping is a huge part of the speed run. It's either that or you have no backwards speed cap when you're airborne. And then I think you might traverse those whole games by jumping backwards with small bunny hops as faster than just walking forward, or even sprinting, I believe it's faster than.
Yeah, I know there are some games that limit your ability to jump at certain points of it, like, the Zelda franchise is one where you can only jump when you specifically go over an edge. Or, like, there are games where it's like you're in the water, of course you can't jump. And then of course there's like the rare world style games where you can jump when you're in the water. They don't give a shit. But it's definitely jumping is interesting because like a lot of games have it, but when you don't have it, do you feel really heavy? Like do you feel like you have this weight to you when you don't have the ability to jump in some games?
It depends on the game, but I think in general, yeah, not being able to jump conveys a feeling of heaviness. And they often use heaviness as kind of a reason why characters don't jump. Like when you think of like most shooting games, they don't jump as high as a Mario because they're usually big, like muscle-bound, like characters.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, here's the biggest example of that one.
That was what I was envisioning when I was saying.
Yeah, that. you can vault over cover, but you're just small tiny jump. No, you're not gonna do that.
They're meant to be more realistic in that sense because we don't traverse our human lives jumping everywhere.
Yeah, well, in some games like that are more open, kind of use jumping as like a thing where you can use jumping to like get to places in alternate routes that you wouldn't normally be able to take by just like walking.
Stealth games I can think of like that, like Deus Ex came to mind when you said that. Where it's mostly just like that's sort of like jumping equivalent to like if you were a human wandering a city, like you could jump that technically.
Yeah. So are there any topics that you really wanted to bring up?
I'm trying to think as far as I wrote many notes on here. The one I had was sort of like a general definition of movement in games. Which is sort of like a big kind of game designy way to look at it. But movement is a series of rules that a character is constantly like has to keep in mind. Kind of like in a board game where you always have to keep in mind the rules. Where usually for example, the example I broke down is Mario, which Mario has 2 key rules when it comes to how you can move. Mario always has exactly 3 possible speeds. So it's either his walking speed, the run speed, which is if you hold the button, and then the run for a bit speed, which if you've been holding it and running, it kind of the momentum carrying you, you have different properties. And then your jump is always 3 times small Mario's height. And as long as you keep those 2 rules in mind, you can handle any situation in the game. The game is just constantly, the platforming in the game is a test of you keeping those rules in mind and knowing which rules to apply at a certain time.
So we could talk about like let's take in like an action game for example. So like how about stuff like rolling, like roll mechanics. Like obviously the Dark Souls franchise has a lot of that. I mean you get caught up in like you get people who go from like Dark Souls to For Honor and they're just like, oh, somebody's about to hit me, time to roll out of the way, and like it doesn't really work out in For Honor as well as it'll work out in like Dark Souls. Because so a lot of the Dark Souls games gives you iframes when you're rolling, like dashes and rolls and like short distance. I mean, you talked about earlier, some platformers that use like dash mechanics. I mean, obviously, Cuphead comes to mind for me because like you have that iframe dash that's like pretty much guaranteed one of the best things you can equip in the Cuphead franchise. Yeah. Well, I don't know why I said franchise, it's one game. But in the Cuphead game, and that's like immediately the first thing I get is I get that dash because I want to be able to dodge things. It's interesting to have like movement used almost as a way to like evade damage, not necessarily in the way of like being hard to target, but like pinpoint correctly using your movement to avoid things. So like, I mean, that's a big thing in MOBAs. Like in, any game like Dota or League of Legends, like, League of Legends is full of skill shots. And a lot of like characters who have high mobility, they can use a dash to get out of the way of a skill shot that's going to hit them. Big examples are like, a character throws out a hook mechanic at them, and they use that to get out of the way. I mean, that can even go over to Overwatch where like, you see Roadhog's about to hook Tracer, she blinks, and that'll avoid it, and that's her mobility in that game that really allows her to do that. That also makes me think of almost like reverse mobility, well, like reverse where you force movement towards you.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing because you have stuff like again hook mechanics where you hook somebody and you pull them in, or like gravity mechanics where like somebody gets pulled towards the center of something and you force movement onto other people. Those are always very cool to me. I like stuff that really messes around with the positioning and movement of characters.
Yeah.
I mean, like on the idea of using like movement to purposefully dodge things. Like in Dota, there's the character Ember Spirit, where he has the ability to move to his remnants, and while he's moving to his remnant, he is pretty much invulnerable. So you can use that.
Is there like a dash to it, or is he?
Yeah. So he sends it out it runs in a direction, and at any point it'll stop where you send it to, and at any point you can jump to it. You can have multiple out, but if you jump to one, he'll jump to the other ones first, destroying them, and go to the last one.
Okay.
So like if you have multiple out, the further they are apart, the longer he'll remain kind of like in this invulnerable state. But with that character, I mean, I've several times used his ability to not just dodge abilities, but also like dodge damage. Like, you know, I have a damage over time effect on me, and it's ticking once every second, and I use that, like, during that period to make myself temporarily invulnerable. But also it's a mechanic to use to go in, you know, to engage or to get out, and use it to escape. So, like, it's interesting to have movement combined with, like, defensive things that aren't necessarily just repositioning, but are actually, like, avoiding. So I tend to really like characters who have a lot of like depth to their movement and how they can use it.
Yeah, an example I had actually, sort of what you were saying just there about movement kind of combining different systems. Someone pointed out to me, I never thought of it before, but sort of the genius of Splatoon's movement system, where Splatoon's movement system combines three major components of a shooting game together, because it combines mobility. Obviously, when you're moving, normally you have your weapon out and you can attack, but you move a lot slower. When you're in squid form, you move a lot faster. And not only that, you also reload while you're in ink, and you also have a bit of stealth, whether it be your reduced hitbox, the fact that people now have to watch for ripples in the ink, or if you're moving just slowly enough, you actually are completely invisible and no one can see you unless they have a shot on you. And it's really elegant how they have just movement combine all, and you can also scale vertically if a surface is painted. So it has like so many components in just Splatoon's movement.
Yeah, it's cool for me to see stuff where they like take movement and they almost make it like a choice of like you're choosing to use if you choose to use this option for movement, you won't have it for other things. So like a good example, I guess, is like in Apex Legends, the character Wraith. When she uses her portal ability, which is her ultimate, she will move faster, but also, you know, the purpose of it is to make a portal from here to there. Well, some people will just use it to go faster. Like, sometimes, you know, like, people will just use a long cooldown ability just to get somewhere quicker. Like, I've seen it, you know, in MOBAs, there's characters who have, like, a good example would be, say, like, Echo in League of Legends, or Weaver, as another example. They can go back to base, and if you're fast enough, because their ultimate puts them back to where they were a certain amount of seconds ago, you can do what you're doing and then immediately use your ultimate to get back there. And that's on cooldown, but you saved time in getting there. So it's efficiency, but you're sacrificing having that on cooldown for a period of time. And that makes me think of, like, you were talking about combining mechanics. Like Reaper, when he goes into Wraith form, he reloads his shotguns.
Yeah.
They made that change. I mean, ever since the beginning, I was like, please let me cancel this. I want to just be able to cancel out of Wraith form. Because I think it was like, the first instance of it was, this McCree's going to flashbang me. Wraith form, he throws the flashbang, and then he does the full gunshot thing. And I'm like, okay, he's reloading. But I have to stay for the entire duration of Wraith form, and he'll have his gun fully reloaded when I get out of it. Why can't I cancel this? Yeah. And then they added that, so I was super happy about that. But, I mean, that character has... That is a mobility option in a way, similar to Wraith in Apex Legends, where temporarily they can't be shot. They're invulnerable, but you can see where they are.
Yeah.
Like, Wraith has, like, a little bit of staticky electricity stuff where she's positioned, where you can see, and he... I don't remember if I think Reaper goes a little bit faster when he goes to
I believe
when
he does,
reforms.
yeah.
So, it is... You can use it to go somewhere faster, but, I mean, you're going to use Shadow Step for that, because it's the ability repositioning. But, I do like when they bunch together things where it's like, if you're playing as Reaper, you could literally just like Wraith form and then cancel it immediately just to get the quick reload. Yeah. Like you can use it to reposition and reload and stuff like that. And I like the idea of having to sacrifice mobility, or for instance, like having something that can be used to either engage or disengage, where like you have an ultimate ability that's a dash. It's a long cooldown, and you can use it to like go in, but you don't have a way out. Yeah. And then, you know, you can accept the fact that, okay, I'm gonna have to use my ultimate to get out of here, and I won't have it for a while, but it's more important that I stay alive than I have this ability. So a lot of like choices brought into movement, brought into elements of mobility that I think are pretty cool. Oh no, I forgot to bring up another mechanic. I think it's hilarious because like I don't know how good it is, but like, so in Apex, another part of that game's mobility, like a lot of people, coming from Titanfall, they really like the wall running. There's the character has the grappling hook. I like how his grappling hook works. Like, grappling hooks are really cool in games, and his is like almost a swinging. Like, you swing with it.
Yeah.
It pulls you to it, but not directly where it is. It's not like the standard straight shot where you're going.
Hook shot in Zelda.
Yeah, it's not a hook shot. It's more like it swings you. And that character can use it to like swing around areas and like to really improve his mobility. His name's Pathfinder. And I like that you can grappling hook onto people. And when you do that, like you pull them to you and you go to them, but it's not like you're not, Roadhog. You don't have a built-in way to like kill people by hooking them. You're literally just pulling yourself towards somebody and that's it. So it's really fun. Like if you have a shotgun, it's pretty good. But if you don't have like a close range, shoot them in the head of a weapon or shoot them in the face weapon, it's definitely like this weird sacrifice of your mobility. But yeah, like are there any like really cool mobility mechanics in something like a grappling hook or something like that you really like inside of a game?
I think my favorite one that comes to mind is Cappy in Mario Odyssey, where just the simple, sort of simple on paper ability to throw out your hat and have it be a platform really expands the movement options. I'm not sure if you've seen like mobility in Mario Odyssey.
I've seen a lot of like really cool, because there's the balloon game where you go find the balloons.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of that where people have to use the mobility to like get onto cliff edges and stuff like in areas you wouldn't normally get to. Like essentially that game really does allow you to get through the level in ways that whatever way you want to.
Yeah, exactly. It's very expressive in that way, and they do it by you have a huge amount of movement options. Like I don't know the number, but it must be like approaching 20. And at any given moment where you're trying to move through the air, you have access to, I believe, 3 of them at max. And it's really cool to see which ones are tooled for which scenarios, like which one get you the longest distance, which is probably going to be a throw your cap out, long jump to it, long jump again sort of thing. It's really fun. Or actually, I guess the most horizontal movement you can get is throw your cap out, long jump to it, you do the long cap jump after, and then you throw out your hat and dive for it. That's probably the most horizontal distance you can cover, and you can do it pretty fast. And I really like how Mario Odyssey moves. It reminds me a lot of Mario Sunshine, but just better in the case of how good it feels without feeling like you're messing something up really often, as would often happen with Flood.
Yeah, it's really cool to think about like the movement, like the way that you choose to go about movement being like a self-expressive thing, the way you move your character. Like, for instance, if you are a very aggressive player in a multiplayer game, then you use your movement options to like really go in and to try and like almost panic people by like getting on top of them immediately. Or if you're somebody who tries to like use the movement to like evade and get away from people and reposition yourself. And even just when you're going through it, like a single player game, like how you use the mobility and the movement. I mean, again, since I've been playing Gears, one of my favorite features they added to the game, I just love it, is the ability where, like, if you vault over cover and kick somebody, you can just knife them in the chin.
Oh, nice.
It's pretty cool, and it's a cool way to kill people where you use the movement of getting over cover to kill somebody. You use the movement in the game to kill somebody.
Yeah.
And I think that that's pretty cool. I think that implementing, like, mechanics where the movement has, like, such an important part of the game is really just a lot of fun when it comes to really learning the game and mastering something when movement is such an important part of it. So, are there any other topics you wanted to talk about when it came to movement? Was there anything else you were thinking?
I guess a general one I had, it was the first thing I wrote, which was I kind of tried to think of, like, the goals of movement in the game, or maybe the sort of different design philosophies when it comes to movement. And I came up with 5, but they really boiled down to 2, which is the first 2. Of either you try to make movement to be fun or self-expressive, like we've discussed a lot with Mario and sort of games that give you your whole range of movement options at once. And then also games that want to be difficult with their movement or deliberate. You mentioned Dark Souls as an example of that earlier, and I think when I first thought of it, I thought Dark Souls, I thought Monster Hunter, games where your movement options are very limited, but they're very powerful, and you need to sort of commit to each of them in order to effectively...
Yeah, that series is a game, that's a series of committing.
Yeah, I think both Dark Souls and Monster Hunter work the similar ways of Your dash usually has a high number of iframes, but it's not so high that your dash is completely invincible. You need to be very careful of how to use it.
Yeah.
Another example of deliberate movement I use, which is one you normally don't think about moving, because most people, well, I guess people think of it when it comes to movement, but they think of it as bad movement. But tank controls, where tank controls, again, comes from this Arcadian design philosophy of you want the game to be not super easy like a Mario where you get total freedom. Their goal is to take away some freedom from you to put some other goal. Like in the example of Resident Evil, your movement is made more restrictive because that's part of the survival horrorness of it.
And I think that goes on the part of, like, when I talk about restricted movement.
Yeah.
Like, when you're using movement to convey an idea, to control something, like, you know, people... probably the most common way is, like, you know, oh, your character's got to slow down because, like, I don't know, like, they're having a vision of something, or, like, they're having a memory. There's things flashing in front of you for the character, and then, like, they're moving slowly because dialogue is happening. But then you have stuff like that where, like, the restriction on not only the movement, but also, like, the camera angles. Like, we can talk about I almost said Left 4 Dead. We can talk about Resident Evil in a lot of different ways other than just the movement. But the movement in Resident Evil is very restricting, and that does add to the horror element, because, like, you have to commit to shooting. You have to stop moving. You can't do that. And it's interesting to me because you can talk about movement in a way like... an example, I guess, would be in, like, Dota, where you have to... There's turn radius. Your character has to turn around, which means they have to stop moving, turn around, attack, turn back around, and start moving again when they want to run away and shoot at somebody. And that's not the same as it is in something like League of Legends, or even just something like a shooter where, like, you can change the sensitivity. You are literally, that's a point of balance in that game, where, like, there are characters who have their turn radius nerfed or their turn radius buffed because characters need to be able to turn really quickly. Like a character like Storm Spirit, whose ultimate ability is he turns into a ball of lightning and shoots in a direction. He's one of the most mobile characters in the whole game, but if he's looking at you and he wants to run away from you, he has to turn around fully, and then he starts going in that direction. So you have that time period he's committing to turning where he's not invulnerable, he's not untargetable, and you can punish him for that. And that's like, he's gotten his turn radius nerfed before, and it has affected his gameplay. Something as simple as literally just the speed at which somebody can turn can have such a big effect on, like, certain gameplay elements. And I mean, anybody who plays an FPS knows, like, they want their sensitivity to be... they want to be able to 180 real easy.
I was going to say, that's an important facet of, like, designing movement systems in games, which is to kind of have a lot of knobs you can turn to kind of tweak balancing, if it... not even just balancing if it's a multiplayer game, but also just kind of the feel of it if it's a single-player game, to have in consideration things like turn radius, how fast you want to move innately if, say, you're designing a first-person game that uses, like, a two-stick control method, or how even just what number you want your base speed to be, what you want the run speed to be, the speed cap. All these numbers are things for designers to keep in mind, to think about when they're tweaking just how they want a game to feel and how important they could be.
Yeah, I have distinct memories of being younger and playing, like, Nintendo 64 titles, and when I'm, like, walking somewhere, when I'm moving somewhere, jumping. Just jumping because I wanted to get there faster, and in my, like, small child mind, I was like, this has got to be slightly faster, right? Like in Donkey Kong 64, I'd just be like kicking or jumping or doing something, thinking I could get places faster to lower the time between getting locations. And it's so interesting how that's, like, ingrained in my mind to try and use the game to get places faster instead of just pushing forward on the joystick or pushing forward on the keyboard and just knowing where I'm just going to get there eventually. But not to say, obviously, that getting places fastest is the most optimal ideal thing. It's definitely, like I've said before, sometimes making it so somebody's got to walk through an area and experience it is really cool for the atmosphere and really cool for the game.
Yeah, they both aim towards different sort of design philosophies.
It's crazy how much movement affects games, and just, like, it affects the gaming experience, really.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's why I wanted to talk about it. Yeah. That's why I wanted this topic. And we can talk about... I'm trying to think. So, like, when I think of Dark Souls, another thing I think about is animations.
Yeah.
I don't really want to include that in movement because, like, it's a form of movement, but, like, animations are on a whole nother spectrum we're talking about right now.
In that game, it's like the cost of movement.
Yeah.
What it serves.
So that could be a whole nother topic to talk about, is like animations, how they affect gameplay, like how they affect how you perceive everything and how you experience everything. But and so that could be our next topic. We could talk about something else. We'll figure it out. But I think are you pretty good on most of the topics we were trying to talk about?
I'm trying to think if there's something I haven't. I'm just going over my notes. Oh, a small comment I made was it's interesting that movement can be both a small component in games, like say like in FPS where some of them might have it as more major, but usually you'd say that in FPS the movement's like a component of the main gameplay, but in other games it's the entire gameplay. Like Mario, that's the point of it, but also things like Spider-Man. Like you don't play a Spider-Man game to really want to.
It really makes you feel like Spider-Man.
Exactly, like they always say. But that is really the point of it. Like that's why people liked Spider-Man that came out in the PS4.
That's why people liked that's a big part of stealth games.
Yeah,
like the way you move in Assassin's Creed, the way you move in a Batman game, you feel like you are this stealthy, sneaky individual that's like moving through areas. I mean, it's so weird because I've been playing through Metro Exodus, and that game has you like. There's sections where like you can do the whole section stealthing, but it's so weird from a first-person perspective because you're pretty much just crouch walking everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, you're just crouch walking to avoid being seen and not make noise. That ties into sound design, I suppose, when you talk about something like Overwatch or other shooters where if you crouch walk, you don't make foot noises, but when you walk normally or when you run, you make bang, bang, bang. It definitely... It reminds me of one that like more does it with the visual design was like in Halo Reach when you had the cloaking.
Yeah.
Or even in most Halo games, I believe. It's just Reach had like the worst cloaking. It was like it looks kind of like some dirty waters in front of you, but essentially, if somebody was like crouched and if you crouch walked, you maintained mostly invisible. Yeah. People could see a little bit, but not a ton. But if you were like normal moving while you were cloaked inside of Halo Reach, it was extremely noticeable. Yeah, it was straight up like there was a phantasm just kind of approaching you. And so that's interesting where you restricted the movement to achieve something. Yeah. And it's your choice. Because I used to use that all the time. I mean, I loved being that guy inside of the shooting games where literally it's just like when I used to play the Call of like Modern Warfare, I would just do the thing where you couldn't see me on the radar and I had silenced guns and I would just be sneaky and people would just rely so much on their radar that they would just assume nobody was there. They'd turn a corner and I'd just shoot them. But yeah, in stealth games, movement is an absolutely super important thing. And that's like, you have restricted movement. Like even, let's think of like stealth segments, like Wind Waker. Yeah. In Wind Waker, when you get in the barrel, you're not moving like super fast in the barrel. You're just kind of slow rolling in the barrel and then you stop whenever you want to hide in it. Yeah. And that adds tension. Like making it so somebody can't move very quickly to get through areas they have to meander through is a big tension builder.
Especially with how the Moblin AI worked, where sometimes the Moblin AI, you could be completely safe, but the Moblin AI would sometimes still look at you anyways, and it'd have the camera zoom in and make the sharp noise that they would make when like you've been spotted, but then they sort of move up to you, sniff around, and then they go back to what they were doing.
Yeah, definitely. Tension is something that can really, really be developed by movement and like how fast characters move. I guess I should go into AI movement because like in the new Gears game, there's this huge big guy got two big maces in his arms, and you're like, okay, he's just a big meandering dude. He's gonna slow roll up to me, and then suddenly he just gets real pissed off, and he just starts sprinting at you, and he just slams the ground, and it's terrifying. And it reminds me of Gears 1 with the Berserker, where like you have these giant, massive, heavy things that look at you, and then they're like, fuck that guy, and then they just start running at you. That whole like I get, what is it, crocodiles that can run real fast forward but they're not very good at turning. Yeah, it's like the crocodile thing of like you're just like, I need to fucking roll out of the way, I need to get out of here. It's like a boulder rolling at you, and that can really just be horrifying to see like something change from being so slow and meandering to suddenly moving fast. I mean, zombie games do that all the time. Yeah. You have like some zombies will be slow and then some will just just run at you, just straight down the track. You're just like, oh god. So I mean, I'm trying to think. Can you think of another game that really like uses its movement with its enemies to really like change up how you experience it?
I think the example that came to mind immediately was Metroid Fusion, where not even think of most of the enemy movements because they have pretty standard enemy movements, but the SAX, the main antagonist of Metroid Fusion. Are you familiar with Metroid Fusion?
Yeah.
It moves so unnaturally that because it moves oddly slow for everything in the game. It moves slower than Samus's walking pace. It moves very deliberately, and that really adds into like the horror feeling. I truly feel like Metroid Fusion is a horror game, a survival horror game. Maybe not so much survival because you're pretty overpowered like usually in Metroid games.
You're pretty power suited.
Yeah, but the SAX is a huge way to try. It's kind of like the pyramid head of that game, where if you get caught by it and you don't like outmaneuver it, you are gonna die. There's nothing you could do to beat SAX until the end of the game. And I've always just liked how the music completely cuts out. You hear just the footsteps, and they're very slow. But you can use that as like your audio cue, and this is again in like the sound design kind of thing, to know when it leaves a room and when you're safe, but also like when you're in danger. Like when it spots you, it moves so quickly towards you. It beelines towards you. It just screw attacks right into you.
Well, yeah, because like it's like Mr. X.
Yeah.
Inside Resident Evil, where like literally just it's this slow meandering thing, but it's looming over you and it's coming at you, and you're like, I need to get out. And I was also thinking about like let's think about like 2D games and a lot of bosses. I guess not necessarily even just 2D games. A lot of bosses sometimes to ramp up difficulty, things go faster.
Yeah.
Like suddenly it's moving faster. Like you have. Like, say, for instance, I guess easy examples, just like, a laser beam across the ground, it's moving back and forth, and you gotta jump over it. Well, suddenly it's going faster, and you have to, like, increase your pace of jumping over it. Suddenly there's a boss, when he ground pounds, the waves from the ground pound come at you faster and stuff like that, where, like, the speed at which things are moving are supposed to increase the difficulty. It's supposed to make it seem more dire when everything is faster and, more difficult. It's an expansive part of design. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I have two more major points. That the one was we talked about games where you have, or I mentioned games where you have all your movement options at the beginning, but also games where you don't start with all your movement options, and gaining more movement options is a reward for the gameplay.
So like kind of like Zelda when you get like a grappling hook.
Zelda, like a lot of Metroidvania games do it, where you get the additional movement upgrades. Like Metroid, the example I used is Metroid as like the first like minute of Metroid, the original NES Metroid, teaches you so much about movement like across genres, because if you approach it like a normal NES game like you would at the time, you move right. And if you move right, you see there's a wall, and it teaches you that moving right isn't the only way to gain progress, and in fact will not get you any progress in this game, so you need to go left. And when you get left, you get the Morph Ball as your first power-up. And getting the Morph Ball as your first power-up completely recontextualizes the game and teaches you that now whenever you see a hole in the wall, this isn't a blockade anymore. This is, I have a way to go through each and every hole I encounter. And a different way that it works, not just in Metroidvania games, are kind of like games with skill trees, and some of the options on the skill trees give you more movement options, which sort of get into more like player expressiveness, where they choose the option that seems fun to them, but also allows you to give you more options to kind of recontextualize the level design of the game by seeing like, oh, I have the tool for this situation now, so I know not to be afraid of this situation or to look for this situation, so I know to use my tool that's really good against it.
Yeah, I was thinking of like perspective shifts with movement. Like one game I absolutely love, and I would love to see a sequel to it. It's got an HD remix. It's Stranger's Wrath. And that game it shifts it wanted to do this thing where it shifts between first and third person. But when you shift between first and third person, it's not just a perspective shift of like, now I'm in third person, I'm shooting. Now I'm in first person, I'm shooting. Third person was only for movement. So when you were moving around, you were like, if you started running real fast, you'd get down on all fours. And then like, it was almost platformer-esque for a lot of the area of like moving around, where you'd like shimmy across lines and you'd have to jump on things. And it was very platformer, but when you got into combat, unless you were trying to run away from enemies, because you could use it to like run away from enemies.
Yeah.
You would get back into the first person. I've got my crossbow on my arm to shoot things with position of like a view, and so like that game was where it decided it wanted its movement to be separate from its shooting. It wanted the perspective to shift when you did movement. So it kind of decided that like there were two gameplay elements and they were going to kind of separate them.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of interesting to me because I don't see a lot of games try and like, I guess really like shift between gameplay styles. Where it shifts almost like between a platformer and a first-person shooter, and instead of trying to like fuse them together, it just puts you in that. Like, I mean, you have like the classic Banjo Kazooie mini game where you have Kazooie as a gun. And suddenly it's a first-person segment. They did that inside of Rareware like to do that
all across
with some of their wacky mini game stuff. Yeah, because they had it in DK64 too. But I'm trying to think of another like game, especially maybe a recent one where like there's a perspective shift that really changes how the game is, how you move. And I can't really think of one right now.
I'm trying to think of of the shift fundamentally changing. Like the only one that comes to mind is like, it's not even a recent game, but like Metroid Prime has like two distinct perspectives where it's the FPS kind of platforming, and then there's also the morph ball. But it's not quite what you're talking about because those are still both exploring the same space in kind of the same way. It just changes what tool set you have equipped. I'm trying to think of a more recent game that has a full-on shift like that. I'll have to think on that.
I was also thinking about games I've played where you can't actually swim in the water. Like, it has water, but it's just water surface, and you swim across it. So all it really does is, like, instead of having that, different form of motion in water, swimming through it, you just have, it's more like I'm walking through snow, I'm swimming in water. Yeah. It's just kind of that controlled movement where it changes how you move. Because I was thinking of because I got on the mindset of, like, games that I don't really know many people played, but I loved, is Hob was a really good one. Hob was a fun game. And that was unfortunately that's the last game that studio made before it went down. I think that was the Torchlight studio.
I believe so, yeah.
And that was a platformer, and it was a fun one. It was worth the price tag. It was, at least. It wasn't optimized amazingly, but it was definitely worth its price tag. I think it was like $20. And that game was one of those ones where like you can't swim in the water, but you swim through it, and it has like that looming. There's a fucking giant fish in this water. It's gonna come and get you. It's gonna eat you.
Yeah.
And so like being in the water was terrifying. Stuff like that, and we can talk about like horror elements in games that really, really work, because there's some really cool ones. I mean, that's one thing I definitely missed the most about Gears of War 1 was like the first time you play that Krill level, first time you know that if you walk into the darkness you are going to die is pretty horrifying. So what was the last subject that you were thinking about?
One of them I guess we could probably talk on a different topic, because we touched a little bit in a reference to like fighting games, but I was thinking about like movement options in fighting games and how much that really changes not just like the speed of the gameplay and the pace of play, but also like the entire feel of the games, and how the presence of movement options just changes so much in how a fighting game like works and has to be designed.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many topics we can discuss, and that's why I like this idea. This podcast is pretty cool because it's just talking about games, talking about the experiencing games, and so I'm excited to have more discussions in the future.
Yes.
This has been a very enjoyable conversation with my friend Ali.
I agree, except with my friend Shane, not my friend
yes,
me.
Of course. Of course. So I think that for now, I think this has been long enough, and I think we can close everything down. And to anybody who's listening to this podcast, thank you so much for listening. And hopefully we'll have even more podcasts coming up soon. And maybe I'll release multiple episodes at the same time, I don't know. But hopefully this will be definitely won't be the last. So
yeah.
Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.